So, is it a good idea to go out into the dead of winter and harvest juniper berries off of a tree that's covered in snow? I really have no idea. Someone does. In fact, I'm sure many people who've been working with essential oils over the years, dating all the way back to the medieval alchemists, have been experimenting in this way and recording their findings. And I could look them up and get the answer right away. But for whatever reason, I didn't want to do that this time. It's totally valid to learn from other people. That's a big part of the tradition, to try to get an advantage and save yourself some time during your experiments. But another big part of the tradition is just testing things out and proving them for yourself and learning on your own by doing it and running your own experiments. That's where a lot of the fulfillment of this practice comes from and where a lot of the deeper knowledge is hidden. So even though it's maybe silly that I didn't just look it up, I don't know, I just felt like I really wanted to run this experiment on my own in the winter, do a cohobation of hydrosol that I have distilled from my previous run, and then add juniper berries to the water, and then use dry leaves and dry berries for the second run, and see what happens. And then next spring or summer, I'll go revisit this again and try again and see how the product has changed. So originally, when I started this process, I was just going to steam distill some juniper needles and see what happened to them. And it went pretty well. I got a lot of hydrosol out of it and a very little bit of oil. So I came back the next day and I decided, okay, it would be cool to do a hybrid distillation where I can throw some berries in the boiler flask and the needles in the top flask, and I should get more essential oils that way, and maybe it'll smell different, it'll smell better, I don't know. So I tried that. And it didn't go very well at all. It turns out that the boiler flask was looking very active because of all the berries in there rolling around, creating all these nucleation sites and causing a lot of bubbles. But I didn't have the heat up high enough to actually get any vapor traveling through the biomass flask and into the condenser. And I realized that too late, and I'd let it boil really low for too long, and it came out smelling pretty bad. So I decided to try the next day to start over, this time using only dry berries and lightly dried needles. I didn't throw any fresh berries in there. And I turned the heat up significantly higher until I was getting about one drip every, 30 seconds or 20 seconds. I thought this would solve my problem because one of the reasons it smelled bad the previous day was it smelled kind of like cooked peas, and I thought that was too much fresh material. I had some fresh berries in there that weren't dried yet, but it turns out that wasn't actually my problem. I found out too late. I should have known, the pine needles give up their aromatics much sooner than the berries. So I was holding out for the berries and getting as much oil as I could, and I ended up sacrificing the quality of the product for a greater yield, and that ruined the whole batch, and it all smelled like burnt plastic. It was terrible. But by this point, I actually thought some of the problem might be condensation building up in the biomass flask. So here I am preheating the flask. That's why you see the beaker over the top of it. I'm just very lightly heating the whole system before I throw the berries in there. And that should help prevent condensation from building up inside that flask and burning the needles or getting them too waterlogged and trapping the oils in the system rather than sending them through the condenser. I also threw a big chunk of ice in my fountain that I use as my cooling system to help cool off the condenser. And you see that pillowcase that's all cotton that's wrapped around the biomass flask. That will help keep the flask insulated and warm, so that way it's less likely to have condensation building up on the inside. And in an attempt to give it even more insulation, I resorted to Paula Dean's favorite technique.
Using two different tin foils.
That's right, using two different tin foils. Except I actually opted for only one layer of tin foil. This, of course, was entirely unnecessary. Just the pillowcase is enough insulation, but I really think it's funny the way Paula Deen pronounces the word foil.
Falls.
I honestly just did this part for the joke. But the insulation actually does improve the efficiency of the system tremendously, and it keeps a lot of condensation from forming inside that biomass flask. It's a great thing to use. I just don't do it in a lot of my videos because it obviously looks horrible, but it does work better that way. It wasn't until after this distillation that I realized the problem all along had mostly just been the fact that the needles are spent much sooner than the berries, so by the time the berries are done, the needles have already been burnt and smell horrible. I was chasing yields, I was pushing far too long, I was just cooking the hell out of it and ruining my product. And I decided to restart completely from scratch. This time I was using just the needles in the upper flask and water with only a couple tiny pieces of bark from the juniper tree to create nucleation sites in the lower flask. I was also collecting the hydrosol and the oil in 50 milliliter intervals just to keep really good track of what was happening during the process. This is what I should have done from the very beginning, but I paid for it with my impatience, and the reward I received in return for that impatience was the lesson that you gotta just do things right the first time and go slow and be careful. And I have to learn that lesson again and again because I get overconfident or too excited and I just jump into something before fully considering it. I will say, usually I do pretty well in that area, but I still get reminded, every so often. These are the types of lessons the still has to teach us if you listen to it as you work on refining your material and you refine yourself in the process. And this time it actually went great. The whole lab smelled like fresh juniper. The hydrosol and the oil came out smelling like a living tree. And I only got a low yield, but that was another thing I learned about juniper, is it gives up its aromatics very quickly, and then you have to stop. You put in the time, you put in the effort,
Different tin falls.
you get a very limited yield, but what little you do get is high quality, and the lessons you learn will serve you for the rest of your life. So now I'm going back to the tree to collect some more dry berries. I already have some dry needles, and I'm going to test something that's a little bit crazy, but I think I can succeed this time because of all of the lessons I learned over the course of my prior 4 experiments with this plant. I wrote down how I think it's going to go. I'll be coloring outside the lines a little bit on this one, using one old alchemical technique and taking some new chances that are going to put my glass in a little bit of risk. But if I succeed, I know I'll feel very rewarded. The old alchemical technique I was referencing earlier is using a little bit of sand to create more nucleation sites in your boiler flask. I chose to use sand directly from my sand bath because I know it's clean and dry, and I'm a little nervous about abrasion. So this is the first risk I'm taking. Next, I'm filling up my boiler flask with 1,500 milliliters of fresh water. Thank God I chose some dry sand to get wet. I take the flask out of the sand bath to fill it with water, and then I'm careful to dry off the outside. That way, when I put it back in the sand bath, I don't get my sand wet. I swirled it just enough to try to get a fine layer of sand over the bottom, but that really wasn't necessary. You'll see why later. Now I add my juniper berries to the boiler flask. I'm using my biomass flask as a funnel to get them in there. Because I've run into such problems with condensation, I put a beaker over the biomass flask before I put the needles in, and I preheat the entire system to warm up the upper flask before I add any biomass to it. fire up the condenser. Technically, this step is out of order, but I do it this way. And now that the upper flask is warm, it's time to break out the needles and start packing them in there. My third cut was the best smelling from my previous experiments, so I take that one and I use this to prime my separation funnel. That way I don't lose essential oils, although this step was also unnecessary and you'll probably see why later. I was actually a bit nervous to begin, so I checked my notes and did a little recap in my head for what I was about to do. As it heats up slowly, we see a little bit of off-gassing and bubbling happening in the boiler flask. And when I look up under the insulation there, the condensation has not started gathering yet, which is exactly what I'm hoping to see. Now the flask is really hot, and I was hoping the sand would help smooth out the boiling a bit. And it has, but not nearly as much as I would like. You can see it's still very active in there, but maybe only 70 to 80% as active as it was when it was just berries with no sand. And I'm afraid there's really no getting around this. If you try to boil so gently it doesn't really roll, you're not going to get the vapor traveling through the still, and this is kind of just what it takes. You gotta use a little bit higher heat to power the whole system. A lot of my time at the still is spent with this beautiful pocket watch my friend gave me as a gift, and I just sit there and I look at my condenser coil and I hold the watch to my ear and I count it ticking as I watch the drips, and I'm aiming for no faster than one drip every 10 or 11 seconds and no slower than one drip every 20 to 30 seconds. And now we're starting to see a little bit of an oil layer there, but keep in mind most of the liquid in that funnel is actually the third cut I took during my fourth experiment, which was my most successful one so far. And I just sit here staring at the condenser, counting the ticks on my stopwatch, making sure everything is running as I want it to. Now, I'm ignoring the rolling berries in the flask, and I'm paying attention only to the headspace and the vapor that's rising into the bioflask. And this is about as steady as I can get it, and as low as I can keep it while maintaining enough momentum to carry the vapor through all the way into the condenser. And you can see here I've removed my insulation, and that's because the scent just started to flatten a little bit and get a little waxier, but it doesn't smell like burnt plastic, which is the main thing I care about. And on this experiment, I'm stopping everything well ahead of time because I really don't want to burn it again. That was terrible. So this is where I start to really color outside the lines here. I'm killing the heat. It's going to take a while because the sand bath keeps it rolling. But I'm actually going to disassemble this while it's still pretty hot. And as I touch it right now, it's burning my hand, so it's a little too soon. So I broke out my half-hour sand timer here, so you can see how long this is going to take. And not very long at all. I already have the arm off and the flask off. I just cleaned it out, dried it out. I'm now reloading it with fresh needles, re-insulating it, and getting it brought back up to a boil, all in less than half an hour. The boiling inside the flask is much more active after being brought back up to a boil, and I think that's because the berries were so waterlogged they actually sank to the bottom and had to fight their way back up to the surface. I've been collecting oil and hydrosol this entire time. I actually didn't think to film it. I was a little too focused on what I was doing, but this is the last one here. We're not getting any more oil. So this is my ruined plastic smelling water. This is the first cut from my successful experiment. The second and the third one that smelled the best that I used to prime my funnel with, and the fourth one also smelled pretty good. Now, how did my hybrid distillation experiment go? Well, I would say the third cut also smelled the best from that experiment, but it was almost as good as the third cut from the fourth experiment that was just a straight steam distillation with needles in the bioflask. So, does this mean I failed? Well, sort of, yeah. I would say it's only a true success if I was getting higher quality hydrosol and oil from the hybrid distillation. But I'm still pretty happy the fact that I just got close. Because, of course, the way you would normally do something like that is separate runs, focusing on one thing, like just steam, just hydro, just needles, just berries, and then getting them as purified as you possibly can on their own and recombining them in the end. What I'm doing is actually kind of like cutting corners, but I just wanted to see if it would work and if I'd succeed. And the fact I didn't completely ruin it is success enough for me. I knew I was probably never going to do better than the more traditional method. A core idea in the philosophy of alchemy is to break things down into its individual parts, purify each part, and then recombine those individual parts back into one more purified whole. After I did this, I did do some research, and it turns out hybrid distillations are more common in perfume. For instance, you might put cinnamon in the boiling flask and orange peels in the bioflask. Again, it's probably better to just do everything individually and mix the oils later on their own than it is to try to stack steps with hybrid distillations. But I'm still pleased with the results, so thanks for watching and hanging in there. Have a good night.